You warned about crisis and chaos if Milei won the presidential elections last year in Argentina, along with 100 of economists from all around the world. How do you evaluate these first months of Milei in office?
It's very unfortunate. We didn't want to be proved right, but I fear that all of our worst predictions are actually coming true. Because what has happened in the past few months is that the attempt to control inflation has been entirely on the working people. It's been a dramatic deterioration in the lives of the working people. And it is one of those situations where finally, if you do control the inflation, which I agree had to be controlled, absolutely. But this method of controlling it is going to be associated with huge falls in wage incomes, huge falls in employment, huge increases in poverty and in insecurity. And coming out of that is a very prolonged process. It doesn't even necessarily happen.
Don't you think bringing down the inflation may help to go back to growth again in some way, sometime?
You know, all economies eventually come out of the trough, right? Because there's a bottom finally for everything. So at some point, yes, the economy will recover. Will it recover enough to ensure that people can get the same living standards they had before? No. And we know that because we've seen it happen over and over and over again in so many countries. That where the inflation control is designed to make the burden on the working class and on ordinary people and on women in unpaid work, then that recovery for them doesn't happen. The economy recovers, profits recover, but they don't recover.
What's the explanation of those people that are being affected by the adjustment and these policies, supporting the same people who is ruling that adjustment?
I think that what happened in Argentina in terms of just the real instability created by inflation and very, very high inflation, which does lead to extreme economic disruption, I think that experience was so terrible that people were willing to try anything. And so, in a sense, now they have bought the Kool-Aid. You know, they have basically decided, okay, if we control inflation, things will have to get better because things were so terrible with such high inflation. And I think that's true. They were terrible. But how you control inflation matters. And if you control inflation at the expense of the working people, keeping profits and all of that stable, and then say that, oh, that's fine because, you know, the growth in profits will then trickle down to all of you. We know that that doesn't work, and that's the problem.
The rise of the poverty in a few months has proven you right.
Yes.
Indeed. It's the sharpest rise in poverty in the history.
In fact, it's an even bigger increase in poverty than after the 2001 and 2 crisis. Yes, we are getting really exactly what we feared has come to pass. The trouble is that, yes, there will be a bottom and the economy will recover. But that increase in poverty will also reduce, but it will not come back to the earlier levels.
That's what we find when we study economic history in Argentina, these 40 years of democracy. Every step up in poverty is never brought down after.
That's right.
What's that? Is that a trap of Latin America, of our country specifically?
I think, you know, I don't agree with you that it never comes down. I think it did in the 2000s. I think after the Kirchner government came to power, in fact, minimum wages were increased, employment went up. And
yes, it does, but after that...
No, then you had your next crisis.
Yes.
So I think the difficulty in Argentina is that you get to some improvement and then you have the political changes which once again generate a crisis. Because, you know, what's happening until recently in Argentina, you cannot separate that from what happened with the Macri government. When the Macri government came to power, it basically negotiated a deal with some very strong vulture funds to get back into international credit markets. It then entered international credit markets, massively supported by the IMF, by the World Economic Forum and everybody, saying now you will have sustained growth. But it was a cynical support because they knew that you would not get sustained support. They knew they would get more profits. So you had a big approval rating for Macri in terms of the global institutions. And he then went on a spree, as you know, a massive borrowing spree. And within a year, he had to go back to the IMF. Yeah, it took less than a year, actually. I was shocked at how quickly the crisis came. The IMF gave the largest loan in its history because the US government put pressure on it. Trump was a friend of Mr. Macri. The US government basically controls the IMF's lending. And the IMF gave the largest loans in its history to Argentina without even the minimum condition that you should not allow private capital to flow out. So what happens? You get a $42 billion loan, you get a $44 billion outflow of private capital. The entire money was effectively, it went on allowing the rich to put their money out. And then you were in a worse situation. And so when the next government came, they had to deal with this enormous hole in the public finance. And they had to go back to renegotiate with the IMF and with all the private creditors.
And during pandemics.
And during the pandemic, during that economic crash associated with the pandemic, and with all of those multiple creditors. So it's almost like an impossible task.
So it's a political crisis, you
It's,
say?
I think it is. This latest economic crisis was driven by politics and by geopolitics.
About geopolitics, Milei is hoping that Trump wins and saying, not directly, by suggesting that Trump will do the same with him that he did before with Macri, that he'll give another loan. Do you think it's a probable thing?
I think it's very likely. I think that Milei is the darling of global capital right now. If you look at the international business papers, they're all celebrating Milei. They're saying, oh, he's going to bring down inflation, he's going to create stability, and then there will be growth. So that last part, we don't know, okay? But it is true, global capital is interested in supporting Milei because he's giving them everything they want. But remember, their interest is short term. They don't really care about the medium growth of Argentina. They are interested in their profits. So they will milk the Argentine economy for what they can get in the short term, and then they will leave again.
And can the IMF do that again? I mean, with its restrictions and with the experience, recent experience.
You know, again, it really depends on how political the IMF will be in this situation. There has already been a lot of criticism of that loan that the IMF gave, so it might be a little nervous or embarrassed to give a very large loan again. It depends on who comes to power again in the US, whether it's Trump or the Democrats. There are many factors in this. Yeah? It will be more difficult for the IMF to give a very large loan to Argentina again, simply because of the experience of the last one. And in fact, even the board has criticized that loan.
Yes. And in addition, Trump is not a friend of Milei as he was with Macri before.
Yes, that's true.
But he can become.
He can become. You know, these right-wing crazies, they love each other, typically.
What does dollarization mean for a country like Argentina?
Again, you know, something like dollarization is often presented as an easy option. Especially when people are tired of hyperinflation, when they're exhausted with very, very rapid price increases every day, every month. People say, well, okay, let's just go for the US dollar, it will give stability. That's what happened in Ecuador, for example. And then they think that once we have the dollar, at least our prices will be stable, and then we will be able to get on with other things. What they don't realize is that once you dollarize, of course you lose control over your monetary policy, but you also lose control over your fiscal policy.
Why?
Because in fact then you have no choice but to borrow for you cannot borrow in your domestic currency. You have to borrow abroad for any additional spending. You can't run a regular fiscal deficit, which every country in the world runs.
Even the States?
You cannot borrow from the central bank because the central bank can only give you whatever dollars it has. And it's a huge restriction. Now, that in turn means that you no longer have domestic policy autonomy. You don't have any democratic control over your economic policy. It's not, the macroeconomic policy is not in your hands. And that's terrifying because it means that already we have economic policies that are presented as something that is technocratic and inevitable and doesn't therefore have to be explained to people or meet the aspirations of people. When you are a dollarized economy, that's actually true. That's actually that the state has no ability to do something unless it raises taxes. If it raises taxes, you will get capital outflow, and that will be worse, so you won't raise the tax for the rich. You will put more pressure on the poor people for any additional spending. So you will get a worsening of income distribution. It is very, very hard to do independent economic policy with a dollarized economy.
The thing is that in Argentina, with the history of inflation, the people associates that degrees of freedom, of that autonomy with inflation.
Yes, I think there is this particular problem in Argentina, which is that you've been through these cycles. But I think, it's interesting that people remember the bad times. They don't remember the good times. To me, Argentina 2004 to 2010 was a remarkable success. In fact, when you look back on it, it's quite extraordinary. Employment increases, real wages increases, much better women's participation in the workforce, much reduced gender wage gaps, much higher, child support programs. I mean, all kinds of good things were happening in the Argentine economy at that time. When the global financial crisis happened, you were not that badly hit compared to many other countries.
No, that's right.
Yeah. Now, funnily enough, people in Argentina forget that.
And do you think that if they didn't brought dollarization during these first months of administration, they wouldn't do it in the future? They are speaking about endogenous dollarization now, but that's confusing.
Yeah, I'm confused. I don't know what that means.
Oh, okay.
But the difficulty with him doing dollarization now, he just doesn't have enough dollar reserves. There just aren't enough. So he would be hoping that the IMF will give him the money to do a dollarization. It's a big ask. It's risky. Or he's hoping for huge capital inflows that will support a dollarization. Whether he will get that kind of capital inflow from private creditors who are willing to place a bet, or whether he will get IMF support for this, which is it's a controversial thing even in the IMF. There are two camps about whether you should allow countries to dollarize or not, because the IMF in general supports flexibility, or what they call dirty floating, managed floating. So I'm not sure that he will be able to get the dollars he needs to actually do a dollarization. And frankly, that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good restriction.
Yeah.
Who is behind the far-right political movements that are rising in Europe and Latin America? Which are the specific interests that you identify behind the figures and the people we used to talk about?
I think we have to make a distinction between the followers of the far right, many of whom are just ordinary people who are disaffected, unhappy, feeling frustrated, feeling that they have a much more fragile life than they had before, feeling excluded. Mm-hmm. So followers is a different category. They are ordinary people. They're probably perfectly decent people. The ones who are inspiring these movements and the kinds of leaders who emerge from these movements, the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the Mileis, in this part of the world, but even in our part of the world we have Mr. Modi and others. They have a different agenda. They are seeking much greater, in a way, authoritarian control. They all have very strongly authoritarian instincts, but they're also completely representing the interests of large capital and large financial capital in particular. And I think we have to remember that you see, that's also why in the beginning they attract a lot of finance, because it's these interests that are supporting them. If Trump wins, he's going to be the Bitcoin president. All these big Bitcoin players are supporting him big time.
Wow.
Yes. So, you know, there are very deep and very powerful financial interests that are supporting the far right.
What about the algorithms and platforms, the big tech?
Again, it's kind of complicated. Some of them, yes, are also strongly in support of the far right.
Because Milei was twice with Elon Musk, for example.
Yeah. So you see, all of these people who have strongly authoritarian tendencies love each other. Musk himself is also a very authoritarian type, yeah? They all love each other. And they love the idea that they can use the illusion of democracy or people being engaged in something to actually control them. And we are seeing this in many, many different parts of the world. It's actually going to be a much more vicious control over ordinary people, which is driven by deep, large financial capital interests.
You used to challenge the idea of economic issues only debated by economists or by technocrats or officials from the government. Milei always speaks in jargon and uses I know expressions, very specific expressions from very specific schools of thought that are even marginal in our regular studies of economics. What happens when that economic discussion escapes from regular knowledge or people language?
You know, this is intentional. And this is, Milei, of course, has definitely been doing it, but he's not alone. A lot of economists, a lot of policymakers like to present whatever's happening in the economy as extremely technical, something you will not understand. Whether it is about taxation or it's about debt or it's about fiscal policy, they will have all these rules, they will have the jargon, they will have all these words, and people will say, okay, I don't understand it, it's all right. You know best.
Do whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly. Why is that? Why is that necessary? It's necessary because that confusion is essential, because economics is deeply political. Economics, ultimately, it's about distribution. It's about who gets what, who is allowed to do what, who is able to get a job, who is able to keep the profits, who is able to extract rent or high interest, how much of the surplus they can get one group from another. If that became clear and transparent, there would be public outcry. There would be resistance. How do you prevent that resistance? By presenting it as this inevitable workings of an economy that simply cannot be questioned. Now, again, to make it appear inevitable, you have to couch it in very technical jargon. And this is a common tendency. You find that even in Europe, it's being less efficient now. More and more Europeans are saying, no, we do not trust you on this. Mm-hmm. But in Latin America, it has been a very common thing. The IMF did it big time. They would come and say, oh, there's no alternative to this. And then they would give you a very technical explanation. And then people would say, oh, okay, maybe you're right.
How are debt and inequality related? How does debt works for keeping those levels of inequality high?
You know, it's a very synergistic relationship between debt and inequality. So debt arises because of inequality, and then it further increases inequality. How does that happen? When you look at debt in your entire continent and in the US, domestic debt, why do people get in debt? Because they are buying or seeking to get more than they earn. Right? That's whether it is for education, or it is for a house, or it is for even your basic consumption, right? That's why you get indebted, because you need to buy or get something which you do not have the income for. Typically, the increase in household debt or personal debt arises when your real incomes are stagnant or not growing fast enough. And that has happened certainly in Latin America. It happened in the US. Yeah, you had stagnating real wages in the US for 2 decades. So how did consumption increase? Because more and more families got into debt. And that debt was encouraged. There was a whole financialization whereby, you know, it's not just houses that you got a mortgage for, you need student debt to put your child through college, you had health debt because you needed something that healthcare was not provided, etc. Everything you did, you would need to get into debt for. So consumption kept increasing, real wages were stagnant. Okay? So inequality created those higher debt levels. And then it blows up and you have a debt crisis. And what happens in that crisis? The small guys get smashed. Yeah? Exactly that same thing is happening globally. Okay? So you look at these countries and the debt, the sovereign debt that has accrued. Argentina, again, classic case, right? Why do you get into that debt? Well, I mean, the Macri case was when Macri chose to get into debt, almost as a way of establishing a very neoliberal paradigm domestically. In many other countries, it's sometimes beyond their control. You know, across Africa, there are countries in debt crisis. What happened to them? Well, they were encouraged to float international sovereign bonds because interest rates globally were very low because of US monetary policies. Yeah? After the financial crisis, they had close to zero interest rates, massive increases in liquidity. So, in fact, these institutions were looking for borrowers. The lenders went out and pushed their loans. And so all these countries took on debt. And so maybe they're doing infrastructure projects like Zambia. Maybe they are doing some other, maybe they're just increasing their health and education spending in some other country. But you get into that trap and then anything can happen globally, which is not your fault. It can be a COVID pandemic. It can be a major interest rate change in the US. It can be a war that disrupts supply chains and so food and fuel prices go up. Yes. Okay? All of those things happened. Suddenly you don't have foreign exchange, you can't repay your debt. You're in a debt crisis, and the minute the interest rates go up in the US, the same creditors who were willing to offer you these cheap loans, they say, now for your next loan, you're going to pay 10 times more interest. Yeah?
If that dialectical relation between debt and inequality feeds it, how do you solve it? Would it be needed a cut in the? Yes. I mean, it's before debt, the solution of the trap.
So when countries are in a debt crisis, it means they cannot repay, right? And this is true of households as well. Across capitalism, through history and in every country, market economies have a mechanism for this. They have what is called bankruptcy laws, right? Somebody cannot repay the debt, you go bankrupt. So in fact, a lot of your debt is effectively written off. Some of your assets, whatever's left, some assets are shared out, okay? Every country has got bankruptcy laws. Every country has got mechanisms to write off some unpayable debt. I am sure today as we speak in Argentina, there are companies who are getting debt relief. You don't hear about it. Banks quietly write off a lot of debt. I can tell you in India, every year we have billions of rupees being written off for large companies. It's quietly done. Nobody knows it. We don't have that system for the global debt. We don't have it for countries that are in debt. So they are forced to just squeeze their people, extract whatever they can, somehow create that foreign exchange and push it. We must actually have a system where you reduce that debt. If it's unpayable, you have to cut it down. There's no other way to go.
And finally, in a productive seek of specialization, Argentina has been growing in software and IT lately. And that's an industry where India heads. Is there maybe a way out of our foreign exchange restriction, our historical foreign exchange restriction?
This is a very difficult question because, India was a big software exporting success, okay? And even today, we are quite successful in software export, but it's a very specific kind. We are a bit like, how shall I put it? We are bespoke providers of software services. So we don't do the basic program, but a company wants to adjust that program for their own requirements. We do that. We're the tailors.
Tailors, okay.
Yeah? Now, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But we don't do the basic software, okay? And increasingly, a lot of the AI-related software, we do not have that capacity. That really is concentrated in the US and China today. And that's a problem because more and more of the software is now embedded in things. There's the whole Internet of Things.
Yes.
So in India, believe it or not, we export a lot of software. But if you look at all the software embedded in the things that we buy, we are just about breaking even. We don't have a surplus. Because every phone you buy, every laptop you buy, every tablet you buy, every machine you buy, every car you buy has got software. And we don't make that software. So we have to be careful about where we position ourselves in this. And especially now with these dramatic changes in AI that are really changing the way a lot of the software works. We're not anymore that successful or front running, you know. China, on the other hand, is. And that's the kind of dilemma that many countries face. So yes, Argentina definitely, it's a smaller country. It can get more in terms of this bespoke work, especially given the language and so on. But I would not put all my eggs in that basket in terms of an overall solution.
Thank you very much, Jayati.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you.